It's essential to be able to read subtle clues, sift through large amounts of information, and understand what's important and what isn't. Intuition is really about seeing vague, emerging patterns that you can notice, but can't quite express in words. I've always been good at that, trusting my instincts, even when I couldn't exactly say how I knew what I knew. And that's how I achieved a lot of success and impressed many people. I'll give an example that got me promoted to vice president. 2 years ago, we were finishing up the acquisition of a startup called Vertican, which, well, the details don't really matter. Back then, I was just a middle manager, overseeing the review of their software code and participating in meetings with their representatives. Something felt off. Something wasn't quite right in certain areas where my engineers told me the code seemed overly complex, like it was over-engineered. And when we discussed this with the vertical representatives, their answers were very plausible, but not quite convincing. So I stepped up. I went to my boss a day before the deal was supposed to close and said, "Something's not right here. Give my team 72 hours to review the product again before you sign." I was threatened, yelled at, and criticized. Then they said, "If this deal falls through, you'll be out of a job." The people from Vertican were furious, upset, and threatened to pull out of the deal and instead offer everything to Cisco, but they didn't. My team worked their tails off for 2 days and nights, and we discovered a glaring hole in Vertican security protocols. So we went back to the table, caught them off guard, and renegotiated the terms. In the end, Mexico still bought Vertican, but it took another 7 months before they could convincingly prove they had fixed the issue, and at 18% lower than the originally agreed-upon price, this made me a vice president with a significant raise. I received a $2 million bonus, which sounds amazing until you realize it was only 0.4% of what Mexico saved on the deal. Possibly the best part of all this, aside from the money, which Lori and I used to buy a magnificent house in Pacific Palisades with a sensational ocean view, is that now everyone looked at me as Mexico's permanent genius. Every suggestion I made was heard, every insight I had captured people's attention. If I ever needed some time or wanted to go somewhere to check something out or talk to someone, it was always, of course, whatever you need. So at 3:17 p.m. on March 8th, when I walked out of my office and headed to the parking lot, telling my administrative assistant that I'd be out for the rest of the day, she didn't bat an eye and just responded that she'd reschedule my meetings. She and my other assistants probably thought has another hunch, and they were right. It suddenly dawned on me that my best friend, Tom Betancourt, might be sleeping with my wife. Tom and I grew up together in the suburbs of San Diego. We were inseparable from about second grade until we went to different colleges, but we stayed in touch even when his job in commercial real estate took him far from the West Coast. When Lori and I got married, Tom was my best man, although she had never met him until the evening of our rehearsal dinner. Of course he liked her, as I figured he would, and why wouldn't he? Lori is amazing and fun, incredibly smart, thoughtful, and loving. I could go on while we were waiting together for the ceremony to begin. Tom said, "Dude, you hit the jackpot. Lori's really something. I almost envy you." I laughed and said the key word is almost right, because Tom was the kind of guy who didn't make commitments, approached everything casually, and loved the company of women, as many as possible. And women liked him too. But let's just say he wasn't the marrying type. That night in our hotel room, Lori and I talked about him. We were curled up in bed together, both pretty drunk. We didn't feel the need to make our marriage official since we had been living together for several months and were regularly intimate. So instead we talked about the wedding, the food, the guests, and about leaving the next day for our honeymoon in Maui. "What do you think of my friend Tom?" I asked her. Her first words were a surprise. "Oh my God, he's amazing," she said, then giggled and looked at me, blushing slightly. "I mean, you're the most handsome man in my world." "Baby," she kissed me. "But Tom, well, if I wasn't in love with you," she trailed off, kissing me again, perhaps realizing she had gone a bit too far. But I just laughed. I knew how much Lori loved me, holding her tightly and gently in my arms. I said, "I get what you mean, baby. He's tall and broad-shouldered, and he's got that charming manner and that tempting smile. He's always been like that, mostly a magnet for attention, and I'd bet that right now he's in bed with one of the bridesmaids or someone else he met at the reception. That's usually how things go with him." Lori laughed and said, "I'm guessing Emily or Kate. Did you see how they were looking at him all through the dinner, and when he gave his toast, it wouldn't take much effort on his part, and that was true. We fell asleep, and the next day we flew off on our honeymoon, then came back and lived happily ever after." for 3 years and 9 months more or less until March 8th. Tom came to stay with us for a few days, maybe a week. He was working on a big project in Los Angeles, and though he could certainly afford the Beverly Wilshire or the Viceroy Limitage for us, it was an opportunity to catch up. We hadn't seen him since the wedding. So he arrived Friday evening and we went to a Lakers game and played golf over the weekend. On Monday he went downtown to close a deal and I headed to work. He had meetings scheduled until 4 p.m. and I promised to be home by 6:30 so we could have dinner on the back porch and watch the Pacific Ocean. Sounds good, right? It was great to spend time with my old friend and enjoy some quality moments with him and Lori. Except for one thing, on Monday around 3 p.m. there was an unsettling feeling. You can't always explain it, you just know the way they moved around each other. The casual glances. There had been a few moments of unease between Lori and me the night before. Just before bed and again in the morning, was he planning to make a move on her? I wasn't sure, could it be happening? Absolutely. So at 3:17 p.m. I headed to the parking lot at Los Angeles. Traffic was the usual, and I arrived home just before 5 p.m., more than half an hour after Tom was expected back. I parked around the corner and walked slowly up the long driveway, hoping my gut feeling had been wrong this time, but it hadn't. There was no one on the back porch, in the living room, or in the kitchen, but I found them easily enough when I quietly climbed the carpeted stairs and walked down the hallway. The door to the master bathroom was wide open, and they were both in there. Tom was standing against the wall and Lori was kneeling in front of him. She told him that her husband trusted her and that she loved him and didn't want to betray that trust. He replied that he understood and would respect her boundaries and give her some time. He seemed to be surprisingly understanding, but a few hours later he decided he wanted her to do something more intimate, and that's how it ended. This situation was almost the same. I was about 3.5 meters away. Neither of them could see me for some reason. I didn't burst in, shout, or confront them. I just stood there watching. My wife has the most beautiful figure I've ever seen, and I couldn't help but notice how she was engaging in the moment. She had her hands on his hips while Tom gently placed his hand on the back of her head, guiding her. I didn't move. I just stood still. As they continued, Tom let out a low moan, and after a few moments he shuddered. She held on to him for a while longer as things came to an end. I was horrified, furious, frozen in anger, and at the same time, feeling a deep confusion. Lori was undeniably attractive, and I couldn't help but imagine what Tom was feeling, but I stayed rooted to the spot. Eventually Lori let go and Tom helped her to her feet. He embraced her and they kissed. She responded, moaning as he held her with one arm and gently touched her with the other in less than a minute. She trembled and clearly felt overwhelmed by the moment. She was obviously very affected by it. Afterward, they held each other a little longer and shared a few more kisses. Then she said, "You're really something else. You know that I told you I'd never cheat on." He kissed her again. I could say, "I'm sorry." "Lori, but I won't," is my friend and I love him. "But when I saw you yesterday on the deck in that bikini, I could barely stop myself from pulling you aside right then and there. So instead you came over to my house today, pulled me into the shower and made me do something intimate. Is that really any better?" These words might have sounded like a complaint, but Lori was still in Tom's arms, still smiling at him and still running her hand over his chest. "Well, it's a little better," he said. "Technically, we didn't go all the way." Finally, she pulled away from him as she grabbed her clothes and walked toward the bedroom. I quietly left the house and went back to my car. I can't explain what I did that night. It wasn't what you'd expect, that's for sure. I felt disgusted and sick, ready to lash out at the two people I loved and trusted most in the world. But instead I drove around with a million thoughts racing through my head, then came home and played the role of a gracious host and loving husband. Tom and Lori both played it pretty cool, though it wasn't hard to see that she was a little tense. As for Tom, what an actor. I was grilling some barbecue and we were drinking and having dinner on the porch, chatting about nothing in particular, sharing a good bottle of wine and pretending that everything was fine, except I was torn between anger, despair, and frustration. Around 1015, I couldn't take it anymore and said, "Well, that's it for me. It's been a long day at work. I'm heading to bed. Why don't you join me?" Baby Lori didn't really have a choice, so we wished Tom good night and headed to the bedroom. Once there, without much conversation, I made it clear that I wanted to be intimate with her and insisted, despite her clear signs of reluctance. Eventually she complied and I proceeded, ignoring her unease. I don't know if she enjoyed it, but at that point I didn't care. She was quieter than usual, probably because she didn't want Tom to hear us. It didn't last long. I was pretty restrained. Afterward, we brushed our teeth and curled up together like we usually did. I had a feeling she wanted to ask what was wrong, but she was too afraid to bring it up. Not a few minutes later, she fell asleep and I lay there wide awake. I stared at the dark ceiling, thinking about the next day. The charade continued. In the morning, we had a cheerful breakfast, chatted about nothing, and planned to go out for dinner that evening. Then I kissed Lori and walked out the door that I turned the corner, parked, and made my way back to the house through the trees, finding a spot just behind the kitchen window where I could hear and see them. "Well, I've got to go make some money," he said. She was standing with her back to him, rinsing dishes and loading them into the dishwasher. Then he added, "Looks like and took good care of you." Last night she turned to look at him, blushing. "I don't want to talk about that, Tom." "Well, my meeting should be over by 4, and this afternoon I'm going to make things even better." "No, Tom, we can't." But he stepped closer, pulled her into a tight embrace, and kissed her firmly. She didn't respond, but she didn't push him away either, allowing him to kiss her. When he finally let go, a worried expression crossed her face. He patted her cheek, smiled broadly, and said, "Yes, we can." Then he grabbed his briefcase and headed out to his rental car. I waited about 10 minutes after he left. Then I called my office and told Amy I wouldn't be in that day, and spent some time at Malibu Beach. I walked along the sand, had a shrimp sandwich and a Coke for lunch, and walked around some more. By 3:30 I had returned home, parking my car a couple of blocks away, and observed the road from behind a few trees, when Tom pulled up. I quickly ran to my car and followed right behind him, giving them no more than 3 or 4 minutes. I made a show of entering the house loudly. "Hey, surprise, I'm home early today." They were in the kitchen, but not standing too close to each other. Tom looked as usual, but Lori seemed a little disheveled and slightly flushed. I pretended not to notice. We had some drinks, ordered dinner, showered and changed clothes. Later we went out and enjoyed some exceptionally good Asian cuisine at this trendy new place. Don't even try to tell me that Los Angeles doesn't have the best restaurants in the country. While Lori and Tom were distracted by some TV star at the other end of the room, I quietly slipped an ambient into her wine. By the time we got home, she was already half asleep, honey. I don't know what's happening, but I just can't keep my eyes open. I smiled and helped her onto the couch, and within 10 minutes she was completely out. I smiled at Tom, helped me carry her upstairs and put her to bed. "Okay, then we can have a drink on the porch before calling it a night." We carried her together, took off her shoes, laid her on the bed, and I covered her with a blanket, not bothering to remove her skirt and blouse. On the way back down, I let Tom walk ahead of me, and when we were 4 steps from the bottom, I lifted my foot and kicked him as hard as I could straight in the back. Tom flew forward, hit his head hard against the wall, and collapsed onto his back in the hallway, his eyes slightly unfocused. I jumped down after him and pressed my foot firmly against his neck. "Can you hear me?" "You bastard." I hissed at him. I watched as his expression shifted from shocked, irritated, and slightly embarrassed to worried. My foot pressed against his throat, and in my right hand I held a large wrench. He started, then stopped when he felt my foot press harder. "Nothing you say matters. You've got 3 minutes to pack your stuff into your suitcase and get out of here, and if I ever see you again, you'd better have a gun, because I swear I'll beat you to death." I stepped back and he slowly got to his feet, groaning and watching me carefully. Then he turned and went to the guest room, reappearing a couple of minutes later with his suitcase and briefcase that I still had the wrench in my hand as I held the front door open and watched him load his things into his car. Just before he got into the driver's seat, he said, "Look, I really just leave." I waited until his car disappeared from sight, then turned and went back into the house that I made myself a drink and sat alone on the porch for almost an hour, sipping it and gazing at the stars. I suppose I could say I was thinking, except I'm not sure I was really thinking about much at all. Then I went upstairs, gently undressed Lori, and tucked her into bed. After that, I climbed in beside her. Surprisingly, within minutes I was out like a light. I was sitting on the porch with my coffee when Lori came out. She was wearing a lovely blue nightgown. "Sorry, honey," she said. "I don't know what happened to me last night. We had such a nice dinner and I don't know. I felt so exhausted." "It's okay, baby." I gently pulled her down to sit on my lap and hugged her. "Tom and I carried you to bed." A few minutes later, she went to get some coffee and start breakfast. When I walked inside, she asked, "What would you like this morning? Maybe some eggs, and what do you think Tom would want?" "Oh, he had to leave last night." I said. She looked at me in surprise. Someone from work called him and he headed straight to the airport. I think he had a red-eye flight to New York. He asked me to say goodbye and thank you for everything. It was amusing to watch her face clearly. Lori didn't know how to react. Finally, she just said, "Well, at least we got to spend a few days with him." "Did you enjoy his visit?" "Of course," I said. "And you," she looked away, I guess. "So I mean, he's your friend, not mine." "Actually," she continued, "I'm glad he's gone. I like it when it's just the two of us." Then she came over, hugged me, and kissed me. After breakfast, I went upstairs and took a shower. When I finished and was drying off, I called out Lori, "Can you come here for a minute, baby?" when she walked into the bathroom. I was standing there and she looked at me, confused. I said, "Come closer." For a moment, I gently lifted the hem of her nightgown and softly guided her to kneel next to me. "There," I said. "Why don't we take a moment together?" She looked at me for a long time and I looked back at her, and then her eyes filled with tears. She lowered her head and began to cry, sobbing into her hands. I just stood there watching her, not knowing what to say. When she finally began to calm down, she looked up at me with tear-filled eyes and said, "Honey, I'm so..." "Shoo." I said, "You don't need to say anything." I gently held her close, offering comfort as she cried, and when I pulled her close and hugged her just as Tom had done, she began to sob again, trembling. It took another 10 minutes or so for her to calm down and for both of us to regain some composure standing there on the bathroom mat. "I don't know," I said, honestly. "I have no idea." We were sitting on the porch an hour later. "I know I love you and I know I want to stay with you, but I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can go to work in the morning or leave for a 3-day business trip without wondering if someone else is taking advantage of the situation." She looked at me with red, tear-filled eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, probably for the 20th time. Then in a stronger voice, she added, "Nothing like this has ever happened before. Nothing. It was Tom. I don't know." "Yeah, he's amazing." I said. "He's like some kind of sex. God, and every woman wants him and you're no different. Never mind that you're married and he's my best friend, right?" I could feel my anger rising again. I stood up, grabbed my keys and walked out of the house. I drove aimlessly and didn't come back until late that evening. It took the better part of a year to piece things back together. A year of awkward silences, explanations or apologies met with cold stare. Angry accusations met with downcast eyes that I didn't leave her. I didn't hit her and I didn't threaten her. In fact, we never even stopped being intimate, but something was definitely off. No more closeness, no more loving glances or kisses, no words of love or a sense of security together. And there was no magic fix that made things better. It just took time. Lori found a therapist to help her work through her issues. For a long time, I wasn't interested in hearing what she discovered, but about 4 months later, we had a brief conversation about it. It seemed to be helping her, though I can't say that everything she shared with me was all that useful. About 2 weeks after I kicked him out, Tom sent me a letter. At first I thought about throwing it straight in the trash, but I ended up tossing it into my desk drawer. I read it. A few weeks later, he apologized for being selfish and irresponsible, admitted he had treated Lori like any other woman he was attracted to, and took full responsibility for what happened. He said Lori was a good woman who adored me, and he hated the thought that he had damaged our marriage. Blah, 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 forget him. I handed the letter to Lori and said, "Maybe you'd like to read this," and then I left the room. Later that day, I saw the letter crumpled up in the trash. In a way, things quietly started to get better for me. I remember one day walking into the house at lunchtime, right after a stressful day at work, and feeling a strong desire to see Lori and tell her about it. That's when I realized that the anger I'd been carrying inside, the deep, desperate anger and the urge to hurt her somehow, had largely faded. The days of coming home each evening with clenched teeth had quietly come to an end. So we had a few weeks of improvement, and then as the holidays approached, things got bad again. I found myself constantly tense, walking around with a dark expression and darker thoughts in my mind, while Laura looked scared. After a few days of this, and nearly silent dinners, I finally said, "Sit with me in the living room." She sat down looking wary, bracing for the worst. And I said, "I want you to listen, and I don't want you to say anything. Especially, I don't want you to laugh, smile, or give me any kind of loving look or say things like I understand." Lori nodded. She looked like she was barely breathing after a long moment. I said it aroused me. "That day when I saw you, I was so tense and angry, but I couldn't help it. I was physically reacting. I watched her. She sat very still. This was the first time we talked about what I had seen. I hate what I saw. I mean, I absolutely hate it. I wanted to hurt you both, to lash out. I was so wounded, so scared. Since then I've thought about it 1,000 a million times. You have the most beautiful body I've ever seen, and there you were doing what you did. Let me make this perfectly clear. It's not about thinking of you with other men. It's about you. Seeing you like that, so beautiful, so caught up in the moment. I paused for a moment and then said, if this means there's something wrong with me, then so be it. She didn't move or change her expression. I stood up and walked away. For the next 2 nights, I slept in the guest room. We barely spoke to each other. Then, on the 3rd night, Lori made a really nice dinner and served a special wine that we both particularly liked. I'm so grateful that you told me, and I hope that since this came up, it's a good sign that maybe you're starting to feel a little better, starting to trust me a little more. I nodded. She asked, did it confuse you? I looked away and nodded again. Lori came over and knelt in front of me, resting her head on my lap. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, then she lifted her head. There's nothing for you to be confused about, she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. I'm the one who messed up. Well, she said with a pained expression. There was Tom, but I'm the one you married, the one who made the promise. This is on me, and I will never stop regretting what I did. And I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused you. She stood up, took my hand, and led me toward the stairs. Come and make love to your apologetic wife. Don't just be with me. Make love to me, and let me show you how much you mean to me. We made love, and it was good. It was more than just good. I wasn't done being angry or hurting or even doubting. Well, almost, but something it might get told me would work through it. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next episode of English Epic. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.